Nearly 50 flights were forced to change course in a single week when Chinese warships staged live fire drills just 150 miles off Australia's coast. A quiet stretch of ocean suddenly became a military flashpoint overnight, leaving the world asking, why Australia?
Chinese warships have been spotted just 150 nautical miles off the coast of Sydney. The Australian Defence Force says they are closely monitoring the 3 military ships that are moving steadily down the east coast in recent days.
Once celebrated as a safe and distant outpost of Western prosperity, Australia now finds itself pulled into one of the sharpest geopolitical battles of our time. This is not just a regional squabble, but a high-stakes chess game between the world's biggest economies, with Australia caught in the middle. So what exactly is pulling the world's biggest powers towards this island nation? And more importantly, why now? Let's break it down. The early days of February 2025 marked one of the most dramatic demonstrations of foreign naval power so close to Australia's critical air and sea lanes. The Chinese flotilla, which consisted of a guided missile cruiser, a modern frigate, and a replenishment tanker, entered the Coral Sea without any prior warning. The ship then moved south toward the Tasman Sea, where it positioned itself within 150 nautical miles of Sydney, and well within Australia's exclusive economic zone. Although it was still considered to be technically within international waters, the real shock came on the 21st of February. During one of its drills, a Virgin Airlines pilot on its normal route between Australia and New Zealand found itself directly in the path of a live fire exercise. This was followed by a direct warning from the Chinese Navy, prompting a quick change of course by the pilot. Fortunately, almost 50 planes were forced to adjust their routes in a matter of hours as well. For a country that was unaccustomed to near missiles of this kind, the message was clear. China was no longer just a distant power in the South China Sea anymore. It was now operating in Australia's backyard. Australia's response to China's activity was swift but cautious. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese had a meeting with China's President Xi Jinping shortly after, where he called out the lack of notice from Beijing on the naval exercises which were conducted in February in international waters. Yet behind closed doors, the Australian government stopped short of any direct military escalation. Instead, Australian naval ships began to shadow the Chinese flotilla at a safe distance, observing every move but avoiding confrontation. The reason for this was obvious. China is Australia's largest trading partner, accounting for 32% of its exports, including iron ore and coal, as well as agricultural products such as barley and wine. Any overly aggressive reaction could risk economic retaliation, and this is something Australia has already experienced when Beijing imposed tariffs on Australian barley and wine in 2020, following Canberra's call for an independent investigation into the origin of COVID-19. At the same time, Australia was facing immense pressure from Washington. The United States, under its new Indo-Pacific posture, views Chinese military operations as a direct challenge to freedom of navigation and a threat to the regional security order. American officials privately urged Australia to adopt a stronger stance and possibly even join US-led freedom of navigation operations in contested waters near China. On one hand, the US provides critical security guarantees, advanced military technology, and intelligence through networks such as the Five Eyes Alliance. On the other hand, China's trade with Australia has exceeded $100 billion every year since 2011, providing significant revenue for sectors such as higher education, where Chinese students accounted for nearly 40% of foreign enrollment at the time. Picking sides openly could have severe consequences, either militarily or economically. However, the Chinese government denied any wrongdoing and described the drills as routine training with international law. Still, a few state-run Chinese media made no effort to hide the political signal that Australia was within the reach of Chinese power projection. For Australians, however, the incident became a wake-up call. Was their country, which has long been seen as a safe and distant outpost, becoming a frontline state in a US-China rivalry? But how did Australia become so dependent on others for protection in the first place? And why does its past still shape the way it faces threats today? To understand why today's tensions feel so existential for many Australians, we need to look back at how the country has historically relied on global powers for its protection. For much of its modern history, Australia's security guarantee came from the British Empire. As an extension of the British Empire, Australia sent troops to British wars from the Boer War in South Africa to the First World War and again in World War II. Australian fighters also fought at Gallipoli in 1915 under the Union Jack, which was so costly that it became a national symbol of sacrifice and loyalty to the empire. However, this security framework began to crumble during World War II. When Japan swept through Southeast Asia and bombed Darwin in 1942, Australia realized that Britain, while also struggling for survival in Europe, could no longer defend its faraway dominions. Prime Minister John Curtin made a historic shift when he famously declared that Australia would now align strongly with America for protection. This shift marked the birth of Australia's modern security orientation. After the war, Australia fulfilled its promise and strengthened its bond with the US through a chain of treaties and pacts. The most important one was the ANZUS Treaty in 1951 between Australia, New Zealand, and the US. The ANZUS Treaty committed the three nations to defending each other collectively and meeting common threats. Though New Zealand's later anti-nuclear policy cut its participation short, ANZUS formed the basis of Australia-US defense relations. Another key force was the Five Eyes intelligence sharing network, which was established during World War II and expanded afterward. This security partnership between the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand provided Australia with access to a good number of advanced signals intelligence and military technology, something it could have never developed on its own. These alliances also gave Australia a sense of safety despite its geographic isolation in a region that was, and still is, home to numerous security challenges. Australia repeatedly demonstrated its loyalty to these alliances by joining US-led conflicts far from its shores. For example, it sent troops to Vietnam in the 1960s and early 1970s, a decision that signaled Canberra's willingness to support Washington's containment strategy against communism. After 9/11, Australian troops fought alongside their American allies in both Afghanistan and Iraq. This was again underscoring how central the United States alliance had become to Australia's worldview. In the last few years, this partnership has expanded with new initiatives, like the Trilateral Grouping of Australia, the UK, and the United States, established in 2021. At the same time, Australia also joined the Quad, a security dialogue grouping it with India, Japan, and the United States. This partnership was explicitly designed to counter China's growing power in the Indo-Pacific. So, these historical and modern alliances reveal an enduring pattern. Australia has consistently tied its security to a dominant Anglo-American power. First, it was Britain. Now, it is the United States. This strategy has indeed brought Australia a level of peace and prosperity for decades, but it also means that its foreign policy has often influenced decisions. These alliances indeed provided Australia with security, but at what cost to its genuine independence? And how is money, especially from China, becoming the new chain holding it down? For decades, Australia has been the envy of much of the developed world. Blessed with abundant natural resources and a stable democratic system, the country built its modern prosperity on exporting what other nations desperately needed. At the heart of that success story was the big brother, China. The relationship between both countries began growing rapidly back in the early 2000s, when China's industrial boom was consuming enormous quantities of raw materials. The iron ore from Western Australia became a crucial aspect of China's urban expansion, powering the steel mills that built many megacities across the country seemingly overnight. Even Australia's educational and tourism sectors aren't left behind. In 2024, Chinese students made up 22% of international students at major Australian universities, while Chinese tourists contributed billions to local economies from Sydney to Cairns. Since 2023, two-way trade between the two nations has exceeded $325 billion, providing a significant margin for Australia's trade with other partners, such as Japan, the United States, and South Korea. At this point, it wasn't just big companies reaping the benefits. Mining towns in Western Australia also thrived, while local farmers secured reliable buyers. But this success came with a risk: dependency. When one market becomes your primary customer, you are no longer simply trading. you are economically tied to their political and economic decisions. Unfortunately for Australia, it learned the hard way during the COVID-19 pandemic. In April 2020, then Prime Minister Scott Morrison called for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID-19. This announcement, intended as a transparency measure, was perceived in Beijing as a direct political attack. China's response was swift and brutal. It slapped tariffs of up to 80% on Australian barley. One of Australia's most celebrated export products, wine, was also targeted with anti-dumping duties, which effectively froze its market access. The result of this move was staggering. Wine exports to China went down by over 90% within months. While Australia eventually found new markets in other countries like India and Indonesia, the immediate damage was already done. Even sectors like education and tourism were disrupted as Chinese students and visitors disappeared almost overnight due to the pandemic travel bans. Some analysts argue that Australia was essentially wearing an economic golden handcuff. So, if China holds Australia's economy and America holds its security, where else can it turn? Could new allies hold the key to its future? Australia's second greatest challenge does not come from China's economic power, but from the shifting expectations of its long-standing ally, the United States. This is because, for decades, the US-Australia alliance has been based on shared democratic views and common defense interests. Yet in recent years, American foreign policy has evolved in ways that make even its closest allies nervous. This shift became clear during the first term of President Donald Trump through his America First approach. Unlike his predecessors, Trump views foreign policy primarily through a transactional lens. In other words, what financial or strategic advantage does America get from any particular partnership? Long-standing security guarantees, such as those protecting countries like Australia, were openly questioned. In one memorable episode, Trump reportedly clashed with then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull over a refugee resettlement agreement, calling it a dumb deal during the first phone call. While the alliance between both nations remains strong, Australians have begun asking hard questions. Can they rely on a superpower that is itself facing internal divisions and an unpredictable political climate? In the course of this subtle confrontation, Europe has emerged as an unexpected alternative partner. Traditionally focused on its neighborhood, Europe seems to now be taking a more active interest in the Indo-Pacific. France, alongside its territories in the Pacific, has continued to increase its naval patrols. Germany also sent a warship through the South China Sea back in 2021 for the first time since 2002. The EU released an Indo-Pacific strategy the same year, which signaled its intent to play a stronger role in balancing China's influence. For Australia, this was a welcome development, as deepening its ties with Europe could mean greater access to technology, defense, and diversified trade. The EU-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which is currently in advanced negotiations, is one sign of this shift. Even without the US security guarantee, Europe's economic and diplomatic weight could help offset some of Australia's dependence on China. India also plays a key role in this emerging strategy. The two countries signed the Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement back in 2022, which aimed to eliminate tariffs by over 90% of Australian goods exports and laid the groundwork for a broader partnership in other critical sectors. But alliances alone don't explain why Australia is so important. Is there something about its very location and resources that make it a prize every superpower is fighting so hard to get? If you look at a map of the world and trace your finger from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, one country stands out: Australia. This massive landmass sits like a hinge between two of the world's most important bodies of water and effectively gives it strategic leverage that only a few nations possess. For centuries, geography has indeed been destiny, and in today's Indo-Pacific rivalry, Australia's position has become one of the greatest geopolitical prizes of all. At its topmost edge, Australia sits near Southeast Asia's busiest sea lanes, such as the Strait of Malacca, where an estimated 40% of global trade and much of the world's oil shipments pass every year. Whoever influences these waters has significant leverage over the flow of global goods. Australia itself controls a vast exclusive economic zone that covers nearly 8.2 million square kilometers, including access to critical choke points that connect the Indian Ocean with the Pacific. This geography also brings Australia into close proximity to one of the most contested areas in the world, the South China Sea. China claims almost the entire sea as its own through its so-called 9-dash line. The United States, India, Japan, and European nations have repeatedly emphasized freedom of movement over the waters there. While Australia is not a claimant in the dispute, its shipping routes and security commitments make it impossible for Canberra to ignore the tensions. Beyond shipping, Australia's wealth in natural resources adds another dimension to why powerful nations compete for its friendship. The world is currently undergoing a massive transition toward renewable energy and advanced technologies, and this requires materials like rare earth minerals. Australia also ranks among the top suppliers of lithium, cobalt, and rare earth metals, which gives it an outsized role in global supply chains. For context, Australia holds the highest record in the production of lithium since 2015, and much of it eventually ended up in Chinese battery factories. Energy resources have also made Australia a heavyweight player, as it is one of the world's top exporters of liquefied natural gas. In an era where countries are rethinking energy security and moving away from Russian supplies due to its war in Ukraine, Australia's LNG capacity is seen as critical to regional stability. Add to this its coal exports, which remain in high demand across Asia, and you have a country that is capable of shaping energy dynamics for decades. Then we have the Antarctic Gateway. Australia controls 42% of the Antarctic landmass under its claim, and its southern ports serve as launching pads for many scientific and commercial expeditions. As climate change continues to intensify and the polar regions become more accessible, competition for influence over the potential of Antarctica's resources and strategic position is quietly heating up. For countries looking far into the future, Australia is not just about today's regional tensions, it's about tomorrow's Arctic and Antarctic ambitions as well. It's no surprise then that all the superpowers and even regional middle powers such as India, Japan, and Indonesia see Australia as essential to their global agenda. For China, strengthening its economic and political ties with Canberra helps secure critical resources and creates a buffer against the United States-led military alliances. For the United States, having Australia as a loyal ally helps its strategic posture in the Indo-Pacific, while giving it secure access to Southern Hemisphere supply lines. Australia's defense planners have long understood this reality, and that's why its northern territories hosted several joint US-Australian military facilities, including Pine Gap. Meanwhile, the signing of the AUKUS deal in 2021, which provides Australia with nuclear-powered submarines, showed just how seriously Washington and London see Canberra's role in maintaining a balance of power in the region. Yet being the price comes with a heavy cost. Can Australia resist being pulled apart and chart its independent future? Australia's strategic and economic advantages have brought prosperity, but they've also placed the nation in one of the most intense geopolitical competitions of our time. The tug-of-war between China and the United States is not just about naval drills or trade figures, but about shaping the future order of the Indo-Pacific, and ordinary Australians are increasingly aware of the stakes. The economy complicates these feelings further, as China remains Australia's top trading partner by a wide margin, and cutting ties could risk severe economic pain. Sectors such as mining, education, and agriculture remain deeply dependent on demands from China. Conversely, leaning too heavily on China raises concerns about losing its political autonomy and being vulnerable to economic coercion as seen during the COVID-era trade disputes. Now, the Australian government faces an unenviable task. How does it diversify its economy and security relationships without causing sudden shock across allies? Free trade agreements with countries like India and negotiations with the European Union are part of this effort, and so are investments in emerging industries like minerals processing and renewable energy technology. Yet, these changes, no doubt, take years to bear fruit. National security concerns have already led to significant policy shifts. This was prominent when Australia banned Chinese firm Huawei from its 5G network back in 2018, citing its espionage risks and tightened scrutiny of foreign investment. At the same time, the country has committed to major increases in its defense spending. including 368 billion Australian dollars over 3 decades. However, there's a growing conversation around Australia's pursuit of a more independent foreign policy, especially one that should be less defined by aligning wholly with any single great power. By building these webs of cooperation instead of binary alignment, Australia could reduce its vulnerability to superpower rivalry. However, building this independence requires economic resilience, technological self-sufficiency, and a clear long-term vision for foreign policy. It also means weathering short-term pain, such as shifting away from major partners like China or moderating reliance on the US. But the alternative of remaining locked in a zero-sum tug-of-war could even be riskier and potentially trap Australia in economic coercion beyond its control. Australia is no doubt at a crossroads. Its geography, resources, and alliances have made it valuable and vulnerable at the same time. Whether it emerges as a stronger, more independent player or becomes even more entangled in superpower rivalry will depend on the choices made now, and these are choices that will define the nation's trajectory for decades to come. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please ensure to hit the like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.